There are a couple of different perspectives, particularly on the presidential campaign trail, that we will get to and share as we set this up, but I do want to introduce our first guest here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Tracy Stone Manning is Associate Vice President of Public Lands at the National Wildlife Federation, and she joins me now to dive into this very important topic. Tracy, welcome to the show. It's good to have you.
Thanks so much, Jimmy. Glad to be here.
I appreciate you taking the time because this is an important issue. And on this program, we've spent a lot of time sort of giving a perspective that differs from yours. And so I wanted to make sure that we shared the thoughts on some of the concerns about oil and gas development on federal lands, dealing with national parks and the rich environment that we have in the United States. I live here in Colorado, and I think it is the most gorgeous state in the country. But before we dive in to this very important topic, I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about the National Wildlife Federation.
Oh, thanks, and thanks for having me. National Wildlife Federation is one of the country's oldest conservation groups, founded way back in the 1930s. We are a big tent organization that aims to ensure that wildlife thrives on into our future.
Yeah, I think one of the important components to that is, of course, some of the public lands that we're talking about, but also just the environment in general when it comes to various environmental policies and so forth. What drives you when it comes to the environment? What makes you so passionate as to be involved in, to be a vice president at the National Wildlife Federation, Tracy?
I'm coming to you from Montana, and just like Colorado, we are in love with our public lands.
Oh,
and
yes.
I'm just passionate about ensuring that we get to pass on this remarkable, one of America's best ideas, really, that we get to pass that on to future generations so that they can enjoy it just like we have.
Yeah, and in these beautiful mountain states, I mean, just the majesty of the Rocky Mountains that we enjoy in Colorado and Montana, I don't think that you could not be married to the idea of loving nature and being able to go out and enjoy it when you're living in a state like Colorado or Montana.
Pretty sure to say it's why so many of us choose to live here.
Absolutely. And more. We're getting too many people coming to Colorado. People, please stay away from Colorado. So absolutely. Well, I want to set up our topic on public lands because there are really two very divergent perspectives that we're seeing in terms of this debate. And in setting it up, I want to play two clips. First is cut 4 of former Vice President Joe Biden running the Democratic side. He's got his take. This is from a town hall that he did earlier this year, I believe it was, in cut 4. And then in cut 5, it's President Trump blasting Joe Biden for his perspective when it comes to oil and gas development, including on public lands, or particularly on public lands. Let's take a listen to Joe Biden first.
For one, I think the way we deal with state lands is we have less latitude, what we say we can and cannot do. I've argued against any more oil drilling or gas drilling on federal lands that we can and to stop that. I think we should, in fact, be looking at what exists now and making a judgment whether or not those in fact that are there, those wells that are there, whether or not they're dangerous, or whether or not they've already done the damage, and what we can do from there by trying to change the attitude of the members of the governors of the various state and the state legislatures. Now, we could pass national legislation, but I don't think we'd get it done in terms of getting the votes to get it done, to say all fracking that's going on now ends unless you can show there's some physical security need or worried about explosions, et cetera, which is a legitimate thing to worry about. But I would not allow any more.
While my administration is fighting for workers like you, the radical left, have you ever heard of the radical left, Brian? You don't want to hear about them. You don't want to know about them. Is fighting to abolish American energy, destroy the oil and gas industries, and wipe out your jobs. Washington Democrats have embraced Representative Ocasio-Cortez's nearly $100 trillion Green New Deal disaster. It would ban oil and gas leasing on all federal lands, and by the way, there'd be no fracking. So let me ask you, Mr. Governor, how do you think that works in Texas? No fracking, no drilling, no oil. Is that okay? Good. I don't think Biden's going to do too well in Texas.
So there's a little bit of a campaign event of President Trump there, and the other one was, of course, a forum on CNN earlier this year. So that's a little bit of setup. Divergent perspectives, particularly in terms of the federal lands and leasing for oil and gas development. At the National Wildlife Federation, what's your take on that important issue?
I think the thing that most people agree on is that our public lands need to have multiple uses that benefit many. Really, really hard thing to pull off, right? Because there are so many divergent uses. And as we're seeing in Colorado, some of those uses now coming in the form of recreation where everybody wants to have their sort of piece of it. But what we think about oil and gas is that there are of course extremes, right? Extremes on either side of the debate. But we are deeply concerned about what this particular administration has done, in part because it has been so lopsided towards oil and gas drilling. The Trump administration has put up 25 million acres for lease for oil and gas development in our country. And that's just a whopping number when we already have millions of acres under lease and when the market is unfortunately in the tank. So what we're saying is, okay, we've got a market in the tank, right? At one point, oil was selling for negative $0, which many of us can't even wrap our heads around. Today, it's selling for about $40 a barrel, which is just, that's not great. It's not great for the oil and gas industry. It's not great for states who are pulling revenue off of that income. So while the market is in the tank, while the supply and the worldwide glut is up, we have a chance to have this really thoughtful conversation about, okay, how should we be treating our public lands? How much money should we be getting off of our public lands? And unfortunately, at the moment, we're not getting enough off of them. Right now, oil and gas companies pay a royalty of 12.75% or 12.5% off of our public lands. But off of our federal waters, off of our oceans, they pay 18.75, right? Big difference. How come? Doesn't make any sense. So there's this really thoughtful bipartisan bill in Congress right now with Senator Udall and Senator Grassley that says, hey, let's match the public lands rate to the federal rate. And if we did that, states stand to gain quite a bit of money. For example, in Colorado, taxpayers have lost $1.3 billion. That's B with a B, $1.3 billion in the last 10 years because of the lower royalty rate. If it had matched the ocean rate, Colorado's coffers would be in a lot better place right now, and the legislature and the governor would have a little bit more wiggle room in this economic downturn. That's one really good example of an approach that we could and should be taking on our public lands.
So in terms of the public lands change-up that you're talking about here, Tracy Stone Manning, our guest here on Jimmy at the Crossroads, it would involve a pause in oil and gas leasing during the time period where you sort of reassess, reevaluate, and re-implement or put into place a new system. Is that right?
Yeah, so the question is, why not, when we have tens of millions of acres under lease? Oil and gas companies already have leased them. The product is there waiting. They haven't been drilled. They're waiting to be drilled. So in other words, sorry, a really long way to say, we've got a giant supply of oil and gas leases in the pipeline, no pun intended. Why not take that time while we've got all of that supply, instead of having the administration just continue to lease while we're at rock bottom prices? Let's take a moment to say, okay, how can we extract the highest value out of these public lands? Because they're precious, right? They are just precious. The oil and gas is precious. It's a finite resource. The public lands themselves, finite resource. We ought to do the very best of getting the true value out of those lands.
So a couple of thoughts. Yeah.
Nobody gets hurt if we pause. Nobody gets hurt. Not the consumer, not the companies, not the government.
So a couple of questions. First of all, in terms of oil and gas development, I mean, once you get a lease, it's not like you can immediately put up a well. It doesn't take and it's not an overnight thing. So what do you say, though, to those who would argue, look, it takes some time. Now's an opportunity because things are going to bounce back, and we want people to be able to, these businesses to be able to have their systems in place, their infrastructure in place, particularly once things are bouncing back. And we need to continue being a world leader, as we are now a net exporter in oil and gas in the globe, that we need to continue that. And this is the opportunity to do exactly that, especially since if you go back 2009, when Barack Obama took office, there were 53,431 leases in effect on federal lands, according to the Bureau of Land Management. There are now 38,000, or at least as of 2018, there were 38,147 leases, noticeable decline from when Barack Obama had taken office. So even though there's a growth in leasing under President Trump, we're still not to that level that we were even back when Barack Obama had taken office. And so now, especially when the United States is a leader in producing oil and gas, isn't this a time when we should be laying the groundwork for more production to keep that leadership position, especially from national security and economic standpoint?
Well, I think that you could argue that the administration has tried to do that, right? They've put up 24.5 million acres of our public lands for oil leasing, but the companies have only bought 5 million of those, right? We just have a supply and demand issue here. And of those 5 million that the companies bought, 1 million of those acres, it's unbelievable, were sold at $2 an acre for the lease. Like, our public lands just have, they have so much more worth than that, right? We are literally practically giving the land away. So, again, 24 million acres offered, only 5 million bought by the market, and 20% of those were bought at rock bottom prices. So that tells me that the market is fine, and we have a minute here to say, are we getting enough for our public lands? Should we rethink this? And appreciate that Senator Grassley and Udall are asking that question of Congress.
Sure. Well, one thing that I'm curious about, though, is, okay, so if the market mechanisms that are in place are not taking advantage of the leasing that is being put up for sale, so you got leases being put up for sale, and as you're saying, there are a heck of a lot of them that are not being purchased, isn't that an indicator that the system's actually working the way that it should, that they're not just going ahead because it's available at lower prices than maybe in the past, that they're not jumping in and just taking advantage of that opportunity? If the market isn't responding that way, what's wrong with at least making them available in certain locations?
Because government is a finite resource too, right? So here we have all these agency personnel doing the work of putting leases up for sale. It's work, only to have no takers. And in a time of where we have to be really lean and wise about how we spend our taxpayer dollars, paying our government employees. Sure. Why are we paying them to do work that nobody takes advantage of when they could be working on wildlife habitat and how to best restore these lands for the future? I think this administration's priorities are too focused on what they call energy dominance, that doesn't have any positive outcome for either the market, the consumer, or the public land lover.
Again, we're talking with Tracy Stone Manning with the National Wildlife Federation here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Just a few minutes left, and I want to talk a little bit about some of the economic impact and especially the revenues when we're talking about oil and gas leasing. Lease sales, about $1.1 billion in, I think, 2018 from the lease sales. $11 billion in royalties that the federal government gets from leases and royalties on the leases, which is a pretty significant fund. And also, we just had the passage of the Great American Outdoors Act, which I know the National Wildlife Federation supports. I'm in favor of that legislation. One of the big reasons for it is because, at least from my standpoint, it isn't something that is creating a new funding mechanism like a new tax, but it actually funds things like the Land and Water Conservation Fund and National Park Service with more money from existing and future oil and gas leases that are on onshore and offshore. And so if you slow this process, especially as wells are used up, if you slow that process, don't you reduce funds that are available to be able to support our national parks and the Land and Water Conservation Fund?
So the Land and Water Conservation Fund is funded by offshore oil and gas leases. And you're right to pause and say, my goodness, like what an incredible bipartisan accomplishment in a time of people bickering and fighting with each other. But let's be clear, what Congress just did is to say, we're going to stop stealing from ourselves, right? 50 years ago, Congress passed the Land and Water Conservation Fund and appropriated up to $900 million, authorized up to $900 million a year to be spent on conservation. Only twice in those 50 years has that happened. So Congress is finally admitting, okay, yeah, we've been wrong for the last 50 years. Let's fix that. And it is a terrific acknowledgement of the value of ensuring that we put aside some places for people for the future. Like our population is going to keep growing. And so our park system needs to keep growing with our population so that everybody has a similar sort of set of circumstances that you and I have.
Right, but at the same time, whether it's offshore or onshore, what we're talking about is oil leases, and I believe some of the onshore funds, well, let's see, $1.9 billion, I think, towards the National Park Service from the Great American Outdoors Act. So yes, it is basically Congress saying, we promised this years ago, now we're going to finance it, but the financing mechanism is from oil and gas leases. So that's what I'm getting at is if you restrict that, then you restrict some of the funding that is guaranteed and supposed to go into the Land and Water Conservation Fund and to the National Park Service.
Oh gosh, no, it's the opposite, right? So the offshore leases are getting 18%, 18.75%. We're saying that the onshore leases should get that royalty, right? That royalty comes back to the American taxpayer, and that royalty is split with the states. So the states have this potential to have much more income coming off of these oil and gas leases. The federal government has the potential for more income coming in off of the onshore, the public lands leases. And it's just a fairness question. If the oil and gas companies already are fine to pay that royalty in our oceans, why shouldn't they pay that royalty on our public lands?
Okay, so you're not suggesting that we put a pause on offshore oil leases? Offshore.
Let's back up. So the 12% and the 18%, those are royalties. Those are royalties coming off of wells that are producing at this very second.
Of course.
Leasing, interesting. Leasing, this bill that Grassley and Udall has. At the moment, as we just discussed, we're giving away some public lands at $2 an acre. This reform bill would
compared to what, by
$10.
the way? When you say $2 an acre, what was it, say, when Barack Obama was president on average?
Also, right, it's been the floor has been $2 an acre for decades and decades and decades.
Okay.
That's our point, right? I mean, $2 doesn't even get you a cappuccino anymore, right? So the bill that Udall and Grassley had changes the $2 lease to $10. You want to lease an acre of our public lands? It's going to cost you $10.
Right.
That seems fair.
But what I'm trying to understand here, because of the pause, you want to pause oil and gas leasing. Is it altogether onshore and offshore right now? That you
the
would
pause
like
we're
to
calling for is onshore.
Onshore
right?
specifically.
Until we can get our public lands. Yep. Until we can get our public lands leasing laws in line with the 21st century. So we're working on a 100-year-old law here. We should probably update it.
Sure. So, okay. So offshore oil and gas leases, just wanted to make sure that you're not suggesting that. So there's a pause on the onshore, and you want to give that time to be able to work out these situations. However, here's one thing that is very important, I think, to the American people, to the economy, national security issues. When we talk about America becoming a world leader in oil and gas development and oil and gas exports, that's particularly because we have seen fracking develop with greater technologies, making it easier, more efficient, and safer to produce oil and gas than we have before, particularly natural gas in the case of fracking. And so the federal lands have provided a lot more space and opportunity because we are so rich when it comes to shale. and so forth in this country, that it's provided an opportunity for that development that has then made America less dependent upon foreign sources of fuel. So even though you may say, okay, the price has been too low for decades, the royalty rate, what have you, if you are seeing that expansion of production, there are a heck of a lot of benefits that come from making those leases available to new oil and gas developers, especially because the technology is increasingly safe, particularly in comparison to past decades.
So I think you've just made the argument for updating the laws surrounding how we extract that oil out of the ground, right? Technology has made leaps and bounds. The industry has kept apace with technology. What we haven't kept apace with is the leasing mechanism for allowing that technology. And because there's just a giant glut of oil on the market at the moment, it's not a bad time to say, hey, maybe we should catch up, and maybe taxpayers should get what they rightly deserve from these lands.
So, however, one thing from my standpoint in looking at the oil and gas industry in Colorado, I mean, the industry, because of this, as you say, glut in the market, is very much struggling right now. And so in terms of being able to make investments for the future, one might say this is the right opportunity to allow for that. And especially because we have better technology now, it means that we can more efficiently and effectively extract oil and gas from the public lands in a better way. And why not do it now from the standpoint of laying the groundwork, since it takes time to develop these wells for production, and then in the future, moving forward, you'll have that infrastructure in place for as the market is growing back into place. I mean, if you take this time and say, okay, we're going to put a complete pause, especially when, as you pointed out, businesses already aren't taking advantage at the rate that's been in place for decades of as many of the leases as have been made available. I mean, it doesn't seem to me that you need an actual pause if these oil and gas companies are not taking advantage of the lease opportunities too much. It seems like now's a time where you could potentially change the law as you're describing, while also allowing for the expansion of lease sales and laying the groundwork for future production.
I don't think we can expand much more, right? The administration put up 25 million acres of land. It's just a whopping historic number. And the market didn't respond, right? So leasing more right now is not it just economically doesn't make sense. And as a bit of sort of, we all want our government to work as efficiently as possible. It's just not great governance to continually do something that isn't working.
Yeah.
So especially when we have so many other needs on our public lands right now, we need to make sure that we protect and take care of wildlife that is struggling. We need to make sure that we figure out how everybody gets to enjoy our public lands without literally bumping into each other. There's a lot of really hard problems that we need to solve for public lands. So continually leasing and leasing and leasing when the market isn't asking for it is taking our eye off the prize of what we should be doing with this remarkable obligation we all have to take care of our public lands for future generations.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. Final question will be where people can go to learn more about the National Wildlife Federation and your position on this. The thing that I'm just struggling with is that if the market isn't taking advantage as much of these leases that are available, it doesn't seem to me that you really need much of a pause at this point, even if you want to go ahead and change the laws, because it's not like they're actually jumping in at this opportunity, especially when, again, you were saying $2 per acre. That's something that's been going back for decades. It's not like it's something that is brand new under the Trump administration. And also the leases still are significantly fewer than there were when Barack Obama was president.
If you think about it, every lease sale that we let go by, where we're selling land, leasing land at $2 an acre, is money not in the pockets of Coloradans. Colorado has lost $1.3 billion over the last 10 years because we don't charge enough for use of our public lands. I just think that it's time that we as taxpayers begin to recuperate that money. It's never too late to fix something, and now is a pretty good time to fix that.
I think that those are two separate issues from where I'm coming from in terms of the idea of a pause and then also possibly changing the law. But I see where you're coming from. Where can people go to learn more about you guys and your position on this important issue and others related to our precious environment? Tracy Stone Manning.
You bet. Thank you. National Wildlife Federation, you can find us at nwf.org on the web, and you can see how you can partake in helping the environment, everything from becoming a gardener for wildlife to an advocate in the halls of Congress.
All right, Tracy Stone Manning, again, Associate Vice President at the National Wildlife Federation. Very interesting conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your perspective today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for the time, Jimmy. Take care.
Thank you. Once again, Tracy joining us here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Thanks for watching this clip of Jimmy at the Crossroads. Don't miss more engaging, intelligent talk. Subscribe today to the Jimmy at the Crossroads YouTube channel. You do not want to miss our live show. Thanks for your support.
I got Jimmy at the Crossroads, making sense out of no sense. Yeah. Awesome.